The program is about to begin. Please turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Hurd. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congressman William Hurd.
Welcome to the Reagan Library. I'm Melissa Giller, the Chief Marketing Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. We're absolutely thrilled that you're here with us this evening. I feel confident that tonight's going to educate, enlighten, and challenge us, and hopefully be a little bit of fun at the same time. But first, before we get started, in honor of the men and women around the world who defend our freedom, can I please ask that you stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, so a quick pop quiz and a show of hands. How many of you have ever had a computer freeze up or malfunction, and feeling stuck, you call your work's IT department? And when the IT department answers, you tell them the problem, and the first thing they tell you is, have you tried rebooting? I'm guilty, very, very guilty. Well, here at the Reagan Library, we've been talking a lot lately about what happens when our country doesn't work right, when it has a problem, when it malfunctions. We hear from all sorts of experts, and we hear all sorts of answers. But tonight's guest has a background in IT, to put it mildly, so he looks at the country and its issues, and no surprise, he has a very straightforward response. Have you tried rebooting it? Have you tried rebooting America? American Reboot, the title of the new book by Congressman Hurd here, not only the former congressman from Texas, but also an undercover CIA officer and a cybersecurity executive. But let me be clear, the simplicity of his title belies the complex problems that he dissects and diagnoses in the book. The Atlantic's Tim Alberta put it this way. Hurd says we'll need both a groundswell of reasonable people reclaiming the political discourse from absolutes and ideologues, and innovative, unifying leadership at the highest levels of government. A groundswell of reasonable people. Music to our ears here at the Reagan Library, but is it achievable, or is it too idealistic? It's easy to be a cynic these days, but as President Reagan proved over and over again, the optimistic idealist can often prove the critics wrong. And in his book, Will Hurd takes on the shortcomings of both parties. But his book isn't all criticism. It's also solutions, a new vision for the GOP, for honest leadership in Washington, the need to address income equality, to reassert American economic and military dominance, and to survive rapid technological transformation. As a child of an interracial marriage in South Texas, who's navigated the world's most dangerous places as a CIA officer, who once represented a swing district of 820 miles of U.S.-Mexico border, who's an expert in the domain of cybersecurity, well, he has a resume that qualifies him to provide these solutions. And it's a resume that might qualify him for something even greater, and that's what many people are now wondering. The book has many asking whether the former congressman is plotting a run for higher office, the highest office. And if he is, there's only one question. Are enough Americans ready to join him in hitting Control-Alt-Delete? So let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our esteemed guest tonight, the author of American Reboot, the Honorable Will Hurd of Texas. So I was sharing with him down in the green room. I literally have like 45,000 questions because the book was fascinating. Don't know if you've all had the chance to read it or not, but I promise I will save time to take your questions. So I will watch the clock when you see me looking over my shoulder to make sure I don't ask too many questions and give you guys an opportunity as well. But I'm going to start right in the very beginning of the book because I love the very beginning. And your book opens by defining what get off the X means. And you say that it's time for elected officials to get off the X. And I loved the analogy. So for those who haven't read the book yet, could you explain that?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the introduction and appreciate y'all being here today. Get off the X is the second lesson you learn at what I used to call the super secret CIA training facility called the Farm. I say I used to call it that because now it's on Google Maps. I always say I wish that was a joke. It's true story. And the lesson is, get off the X means the X is where something's going down. And the last place you want to be when something's going down is where it's going down. So make a move, get away, right? And I start the book with a story. It's towards the end of my first term first tour as an undercover officer in the CIA. And my job was to recruit spies, steal secrets. Best job on the planet. And when you're going to meet someone giving you secrets, you got to make sure you don't have surveillance. Right? You don't want to make sure that the host country's equivalent of the FBI is following you. And so I'm in a little Toyota Tercel, and I'm getting ready to turn down an alley, which I thought was going to be completely abandoned. But I made a rookie mistake. I had cased the location in the morning, but I was using it in the afternoon, and so when I turned down the alley, it was like a parade. There was a couple thousand people, pack animals. It was crowded. And I ultimately ran over the foot of a woman who walked in front of my car. And hundreds of people, and I bust her toe open. She looks in the mirror, in the car, realizes I'm not from around there, and starts screaming. And I have a couple hundred people banging on the car, shaking the car. And I couldn't get off the X because my little Tercel wasn't able to get me that far. I had a weapon, but not enough ammunition for the situation, so I did what they least expected I would do. I unfolded my 6'4" frame out of this little tiny car, and everybody was shocked. And basically, I knew some of the local language were not good enough for this situation. And I asked, does anybody speak English? I'm already in the story. I'll tell the whole story. And this little kid parts the crowd, raises a finger in the air, and says, I speak the English. I said, sir, where's the closest hospital? And he's 4 blocks away. I said, fetch me a rickshaw. Rickshaw is a scooter, the little carriage. And he yells, and the rickshaw comes up. And I make a big display of giving money to this woman and say, take her to the hospital immediately. And she gets in the rickshaw, my little translator gets in the rickshaw and drive away. And the crowd starts clapping. They're patting me on the back. Some dude helps shove me back into my car. The sea of people open up. I drive away. I look in the rearview mirror. Everybody's waving at me, right? And my heart is beating, right? Because I'm thinking my mother's about to get a phone call no mother ever wants to get, right? And I tell this story at the beginning because I feel like this is an example of where our country is. Bunch of politicians, elected officials, leaders are packed in a car, and then people are banging on it. Some people in the car are inciting people to bang harder. Others are ignoring at the fact that there's people banging on it. Others that don't know what to do, right? But what happened that day, when I showed a little bit of compassion, a little bit of empathy in solving a problem that I created, by the way, that warm-heartedness had an instantaneous change in the people that were there, right? And I think that same thing can happen. And so that's why I use that as a metaphor for the rest of the book about how we need to do things differently, right? And when 72% of Americans think the country's on the wrong track, and this has been growing over the years, right? We got to do something different. Get off the X. We don't have to accept the way things currently are. And we can't accept it because I want to make sure that this century stays the American century, right? And that's kind of the whole reason why I wrote the book.
Well, speaking of your time in the CIA, I found it interesting, right? Because as you said, you were the person trying to get spies to help, right? So you have to be secretive. You have to be looking around you. You have to be looking for threats. You have to be looking for advantages. You're always on high alert. How do you take all that training and that, instinct that you've created and turn it and suddenly become a congressman and going into public events and shaking hands and trusting people? And
Sure. Well, look, I probably had more surveillance when I was in Congress than I did when I was in the CIA, because I was in a contested district and people always want to get pictures of me trying to do something wrong or asking a crazy question. And what was funny is when I first started running, I never said those 3 letters in my entire time when I was in the agency. And when I say agency, I mean CIA, where we think, of course, there's only one agency, obviously, it's the CIA. And for the only time you say those letters is when you're recruiting someone, because you want to make it very clear what the relationship is and what that individual is doing. And so going from on August 19, 2009 was my last day in the CIA. The next day, I sent an email to 6,000 of my closest friends saying, hey, guess what? I was actually in the CIA, and I'm running for Congress, and I ended up saying the words CIA like 100 times, a day. It had some awkward moments when one of the things you don't do when you're in the CIA is you don't accept packages from strangers.
Of course.
Because the Russian intelligence is always trying to catch you in the act or create an incriminating picture. And so they would have envelopes of money come up to you at a bazaar, right? You're out at a market somewhere, and they're like, sir, you dropped this. And then you're holding it, and there's somebody taking a picture. And they're like, aha, this is someone taking money. And so I'd be at events running for Congress, and people are always handing you something like, here's a report I wrote, or here's some information. And I would just sit there with my hands at my side, and my staff would be like, hey, boss, it's kind of rude when you don't accept some people. So it made you change some of your behavior. But ultimately, that experience, one of the things I learned when I was in the CIA, the closest you're ever going to get to the truth is to ask a lot of people the same question, and wherever there's overlap, that's how close you're going to get to understanding what's really happening. And so being able to have that experience when I was in Congress on issues that I wasn't an expert on, and to try to have to digest a lot of different viewpoints, that experience in the agency was important. When you look at national security, I did 2 years in training, 2 years India, 2 years in Pakistan, 2 years in New York City doing interagency work, and a year and a half in Afghanistan. So when it comes to these issues, it was really valuable experience, and so I'm thankful that I had that to rely on.
Not to necessarily put you on the spot, but in your book you say we need more leaders who focus on what unites us, not what divides us. So other than you, of course, who would you say are some of those leaders today?
Look, so I look at some of the people I worked with. San Bernardino's not too far from here, right?
Correct.
Couple hours,
That's
okay.
close.
Yeah, that's probably like 10 miles though, and so Pete Aguilar is a Democrat from the San Bernardino area. Pete and I are friends. We don't agree ideologically, but we were able to work together on difficult issues like immigration and border security. John Katko, who is a Republican from upstate New York. I think Larry Hogan is a governor from Maryland. There are examples out there, and for me, we were talking earlier, and I used this example. In my home state of Texas, we just went through primary season. 3 million people voted, Republican and Democrat, out of 30 million. That's bad. 27 million people did not vote. The majority of those people, I would suspect, is because they are not interested in what either side is providing. And part of the problem that we have is too many people are interested in fear-mongering rather than inspiring. Inspiring's hard. Tapping into anger, that's easy to do. And so when you look also at the structure of our system, so I was in the seat I represented, 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It took 10.5 hours to drive across my district at 80 miles an hour, which was the speed limit in most of the district. I found out the hard way it's not the speed limit in all of the districts. And roughly the size of Georgia, it was the one seat that went back and forth every cycle, Republican to Democrat, Republican to Democrat. In the last non-presidential election, there was only 34 seats like that. 34 seats that are competitive. In essence, it means in the last presidential election, people from that district voted for one party of president and the other party in Congress, okay? 34. That's 8% of the 435 members of Congress. That number in 2000 was north of 60. That number in 1980 was north of 150. There's this notion that it's probably been permeating for the last almost 30 years, that the only way to get things done is when you have one party control. One party in the House, same party in the Senate, same party in the White House. That's actually the worst way to get things done. Every major piece of legislation we can think of, every piece of legislation y'all highlight here in this library was done, and I'm talking Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Water Act, Every Student Succeeds Act, and First Step Act. All of these were done when there was one party in the House and a different party in the Senate. And that is how you create lasting momentum, lasting legacy. But because of our system where we're focusing in primaries on the extremes rather than the middle, you create bomb throwers rather than problem solvers, right? And so I think this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed. And I go into some of the math and details, in the book.
So during that answer, you said it's hard to find those who inspire. It's harder to inspire, I think you said. So when I was reading your book, I felt like I was channeling Ronald Reagan speeches and diaries, freedom, empowering people, not governments, the American dream, families being in control of their own child's education, equality for all humankind. Who has inspired you in your life or politics?
Look, it starts with my folks, right? So my dad's black, my mom's white. My dad's from East Texas, my mom's from Indiana. They met in LA in the late 60s, got married in 1970, moved to South Texas in 1971. It was not in vogue to be an interracial couple in South Texas in 1971. My parents live in the house that they live in now for 50 years. It's the only house in San Antonio that would sell to an interracial couple. My father was a traveling salesman. He sold notions, buttons, threads, zippers, stuff like that. He would go to places and they'd call him the N-word, tell him to get out, but look, he had to do his job and he had to figure out some way to deal with people. Right? A lot of places that treated him that way, 30 years later, his youngest son, represented them as a member of Congress. So we've come a long way. My mom, when I was born, my dad was traveling, so my mom gave birth by herself, and I didn't breathe when I first came out. And the doctors were like, he's a funny color. And my mom's like, he's half black, right? So like having to deal with things like this, right? And so and my dad always told me, said have a PMA, positive mental attitude, right? For all the crap that my dad had to deal with, for him to continue to stay positive, that was an important lesson. My mother, I had a speech impediment until I was in high school. In the 5th grade, I wore a size 13 shoe. I had messed up teeth. My head has literally been this size since I was 4 years old. So I got made fun of a lot. My mom taught me, look, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what other people think, right? So I've been lucky to do that. Then I go to Texas A&M, and I decided to join the CIA, and because I was inspired by a professor. And then at the time, George H.W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush, had created his school there. And he found out I was interested in the CIA. He goes, have you ever talked to Bobby Gates? Bob Gates, Dr. Bob Gates, the former CIA director, then Secretary of Defense. So I was fortunate to have people like that in my life that I got to see and be inspired with. And look, my colleagues that toiled every single day, names y'all will never know, who protected us and saved us from things y'all will never know, right? And to see them toil and do that because they love their country. So I was fortunate to have people like that throughout my life.
I loved the chapters on your parents. Now, we've already talked about this, that you say in your book, more unites us than divides us. How do we use what unites us to work together?
It starts by talking about those things, right? And here's what I learned. Whether I was in a deep blue town like El Paso. El Paso is 92% Latino, 98% Democrat. I'd show up and people would say what they were talking about, what they cared about. Then I'd be in a ruby red district that's redder than any red y'all have ever seen. And guess what? They brought up the exact same issues. And there's this idea that whatever's trending on Twitter for the day is the most important issue of the day, or whatever's on cable news is the most important issue of the day. Most people, that's not the most important thing. What unites us is the fact that most of us want to be able to put food on our table, a roof over our head, and take care of the people that we love and ensure that they're healthy, happy, and safe. When you talk about solving those kinds of problems, is where you're going to see people change it. And look, I'm a black Republican that represented a 71% Latino district. Nobody thought I had a chance. And then when I won, everybody was always heralding my demise. But I showed up to places and solved problems that they actually had. And then you talk, and people would always come to me and be like, Will, I listen to hear you talk, and it's like, maybe I'm a Republican, right? And I would say, listen, I'm not interested in you being a Republican. I'm interested in you understanding your values and being engaged in a conversation to ensure we're working on solving the problems that this country has. So while we oftentimes it's always so funny whenever I get interviewed by reporters, they always want to talk about the 3 or 4 things where there's not much agreement on. But 80% of the stuff we can agree, and we need to have a conversation to figure out the best path forward. And I can tell you that that's on immigration, that's on foreign policy, that's on technology's role in our society. We can solve these problems, and it requires a competition of ideas. Democracy is hard. Democracy is fragile. And that is something that requires us to be able to engage and start with that the other side is not evil. They may disagree on tactics, but that we're trying to have a conversation and go in the same direction.
Yeah, exactly. So as you go through your book and you get farther into the chapters, you start talking about some of our threats and what we need to do. And the book I read before yours was Bill Barr's memoir.
Okay.
So I read them back to back. And both of your books have an entire chapter on the threat of China to our economy, and how specifically China is stealing all of our technology. They're stealing our knowledge, they're stealing our infrastructure, and I have to admit it terrified me. What can the U.S. do to remain a superpower? And the bigger question, do you think we can do whatever that is, whatever needs to be done to stop them before it's too late?
Last point first, yes, we can solve them before it's too late. This was the actual issue that caused me to come up with the conceptual idea on how to write the book. So my CIA career began, I left San Antonio, my Toyota 4Runner, the day of the USS Cole bombing. I remember this is back in the day when you're pumping gas, there was a TV, and I remember sitting there being like, wow, I wonder if I'm going to learn anything about that. 3 weeks later, I'm on the Yemen account, and that was October 2000. I left the CIA in August of 2009. In August of 2009, and throughout my career, I chased Chinese spies. So it wasn't like I was unfamiliar with the topic. But when I left in 2009, If you would have asked me what does made in China mean, I would have said it was a knockoff. I would have said China might be close to possibly being a near peer with the United States of America. Even back in '09, all of that thinking was absolutely wrong. And I learned, and had 5 or 6 experiences in Congress would completely change my opinion. And when I thought about that, I was like, let's take the reader on that same journey I went. The Chinese government, and let me be clear, when I say China, if I say China, I usually try to say Chinese government. The beef is with the Chinese government, not the Chinese people. It's definitely not Chinese Americans. What our Asian American brothers and sisters have been facing in the United States for the last couple of years with hate crimes is unacceptable. Okay, so it's Chinese government. The Chinese government is trying to surpass the United States of America as the global superpower. It's not my opinion. This is not me laying in bed at night pondering the world, okay? This is not me collecting intelligence on China. This is what the Chinese government has said about themselves in English. They're going to do this by becoming the global leader in a number of advanced technologies. 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonics, biotech. There's about 12 or 14 of these things. And made in China actually now means made in America first because they stole our tech. And they perfected it and pushed out, opposition. But China is a peer. Period, full stop. We are in a new Cold War with the Chinese government. And this is different than from the last Cold War that Ronald Reagan helped us win. Because if America is a basketball, Russia was a baseball. The Russian economy was nowhere near the size of the American economy. And then the two economies and cultures were not as intertwined. They weren't intertwined when it was the Soviet Union, it's not intertwined when it was Russia. The difference with China is a basketball as well. Their economy is going to surpass ours in size. If it hasn't already, some economists believe it's already surpassed the United States. Their population is obviously larger. The US population was larger than the Russian population. And the difference is the interconnections between our economy, our culture, our people is different in this new Cold War. The two countries can coexist. We're frenemies. We're going to compete on some things, work together on others, but it requires China agreeing to operate by these rules that they agreed to. If you're going to be part of the World Trade Organization, then you got to deal with those rules. And the only way that we're going to be able to keep a entity that's going to be larger than us is by having a big posse. We got to have friends, we got to have allies. Chinese government's incapable of creating allies, they have satellites. So long-winded answer to your question, I apologize. But can we deal with this? Absolutely. Because I'm going to always put money on freedom, entrepreneurship, openness, civil liberties, human rights. Could always put money on that. But an authoritarian government can get somewhere first. And so that's why this conflict is going to determine whether the rest of this century stays the American century or not. And it is not a guarantee. And this is going to drive whether or not our 401ks and retirement programs are going to be able to keep us in retirement to in a level we're going across them. This conflict is going to determine whether our kids or our grandkids are going to be able to get really good paying jobs into the future. And this conflict is going to determine whether the American economy stays the #1 economy in the world. This is hanging over us. And what's preventing us from doing all the things and having the conversations to solve this problem is our political system has gotten mucked up by nonsense, and it's impossible for us to get big things done. And so that's why all of this matters, and it's going to have an impact sooner than we realize.
But do you think that the U.S. government is on top of all the stealing? And I mean, you talked about, I can't remember what company you mentioned, but like some doctorate students from China were sent over to steal all of our technology.
This was so representing 820 miles of the border, you see a lot of weird things that cross the border, right? The one I had never heard of, astrophysicists. Chinese astrophysicists snuck across the border, acted like they were day laborers in order to get a job at SpaceX in South Texas, so that while they were sweeping up the floor, they can take pictures of all the dry erase boards and things like that, right? It's crazy. Can we compete? Absolutely. Let's take defending our digital infrastructure. The war in Ukraine right now is a perfect example where everybody's been like, hey, the Russians we thought they would have been doing more cyber attacks. They've tried. We've actually been fairly prepared. We've worked with our allies. We tried to make sure that critical infrastructure was protected. Now, the Chinese government is more sophisticated than the Russians. The Russians just have a greater willingness to use some of the tools that they have, but that's a good example. There's going to be a piece of legislation that passes fairly soon, and that President Biden's going to sign the law about moving semiconductor manufacturing back into the United States and amongst our allies. Why should we care about semiconductors? Because it's literally the building blocks of every piece of technology, whether it's y'all's fancy car or your smartphone or your refrigerator, right? And why does this matter? If the Chinese invade Taiwan, the Chinese will control 70% of the global manufacturing of semiconductors. If you think supply chain's bad now, if you think inflation is bad now, wait until the Chinese government owns 70% of that manufacturing on tools that are the building block of everything that we use. Wow. Sorry to be so,
Yeah.
I'm like, a little down, a little down tonight.
Go home
Sorry.
and have nightmares. So I'll change the questioning around. So you seem to be getting so much done in Congress when you were in office. So why did you choose to step out of politics?
Sure. So I got 21 pieces of legislation signed into law.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot. That's in 6 years. Many members that have been in Congress for over 20 years have never had that kind of legislative record. And they were significant things. They were, national strategy on artificial intelligence, things like that. I said back in 2009 when I first ran, I lost that election. I lost a runoff by 700 votes. Glad I don't tell that story anymore. I said, to do this job well, you have a shelf life of 6, 7, or 8 years. I actually don't think these positions were designed to be in forever. And I think part of the problem in our system is you have too many professional politicians. And so I thought that 6 years was the right move. And it also gave me an opportunity to continue working on technology issues, working with amazing technology companies that have a national security application. And I also think that, having a rotation in and out of, positions of leadership is valuable. If I would go back in the CIA today, with all my previous experiences, I would do things a little bit different, be a lot smarter. So part of that was the ability to do other things. And also the chance to take a different message around the country. Look, I talk a lot about reforming the Republican Party. And because I think the Republican Party needs to start looking like America. And to be able to have some of these conversations, write a book, put a narrative out there, I think all those things combined. People used to get mad at me because I said I was against, they're like, I was against, term limits. I said, hey, vote them out. You could do it every 2 years. And those same people were like, why are you leaving? You don't have to die or be defeated to leave Congress. Right. And so that's why. Okay. And like I said, it's crazy to think it's been a year, but I've learned a lot.
So in your answer, you talked about, that sometimes to be a leader, you need to know what your shelf life is or whatever that is. So your book is filled with advice on how to be a leader. In fact, I think it's the perfect reading for colleges, right, all across the nation. This might be a hard question. If you had to pick because you list many, many traits of a good leader. If you had to pick just one trait as the most important, what would that trait be?
Your audio and your video need to match. Your audio and your video need to match, meaning the things you say need to be reflective in the things that you do. right? And that's something, another way you can say, you can call it ideological consistency. I behaved the same way, whether my team was in power or not. And my dad learned a lesson from a gangster in Atlanta before he was put in jail with Jack Ruby. Long story, you have to read the story in the book. That the one person you can't fool is the person you're looking at when you're brushing your teeth in the morning. And so for me, I think that is critical. And you know, one of my goals when I was in Congress was to speak to every middle school and high school in the district. And I would do this presentation on being a person of character. And I said, just like being an athlete or a musician or a scientist or a mathematician, being a person of character took practice. And if you couldn't do the right thing when the stakes were low, you're not going to be able to do the right thing when the stakes are high. And so that, I think, is probably, and this lack of ideological consistency, are many of our leaders at a number of levels that are failing to have their audio and their video match, is leading to this distrust between the American public and our institutions, whether it's federal government, state government, local government, media, academia, scientific community. And so that ideological consistency, I think, is important. If I had a number two, it would be, base your decisions based on your values, which means you got to know what your values are, so people know what you're doing and why you're doing it. I'm representing a 50-50 district. You learn really quickly, no matter what you do, like 50% Democrat, 50% Republican is what I mean. No matter what you do, half the district's upset with you. But it was freeing, because I told people what I did. Look, I always say, you're not going to always agree with me, but you can know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And so I always try to outline what my values were. And so that would be point two, if I got a second option.
Those are great. So I do want to leave time for audience questions. So my last question, so you've been a CIA operative, you've been a United States congressman, now you're an author. For a man who followed the advice of do what's meaningful and hard, what is next for you?
Great question. And that lesson of doing what's meaningful and hard came from when I lost that runoff back in '09. I didn't have a plan B. It was funny. Reporters would be like, "Well, nobody thought I was going to win." And so they're like, "Well, what's plan B?" I'm like, "I don't have a plan B." They're like, "Oh, that's what you're supposed to say, right?" They're like, "Really, what's plan B?" I was like, "I literally didn't have a plan B." And I asked 75 people the exact same question. I was 32 at the time. If you were 32 again, what would you do? And if time and money wasn't an issue, what would you do? I got 74 crummy answers. I thought it was like the next big thing for the tech company, I was like, no, I didn't get any of that. But the 75th was the father of one of my closest friends. My closest friends are these knuckleheads I've known since I was 13. We all played freshman basketball together. And he said, "Will, I don't know what you should do, but do something meaningful and hard." And all other things would flow from that. And I started thinking about all the times, like things that I was like happiest. I was like, yeah, I was doing something meaningful and hard. So for me, meaningful and hard, one is it's putting some ideas out there, right, on how we can do things differently. I've been fortunate to be able to serve my country in a number of different ways. The first lesson when I was in an international studies class, the first lesson in the first class was rule of law. And 18-year-old Will Hurd's like, rule of law? Of course there's rule of law. Why are we having a class on rule of law? This is simple. This is basic. Of course we have rule of law. I didn't realize how important that was until I lived in places where there was no rule of law, right? I was fortunate to see and to see a version of America through other people's and other cultures and other countries' eyes. And there hasn't been anything better in the last 247 years. We have our own problems, don't get me wrong, but that's why we're always trying to build a more perfect union, right? And so also now if I'm able to contribute by working, ensuring the public sector and the private sector is working better together on issues of national security like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, to make sure that we're prepared and that we're going to win this new Cold War, that's interesting. But in your question is my political career over? If the opportunity presents itself for me to run for office, again, I'll evaluate it, right? If I can serve my country in that capacity again, I'll think about it. But I think you shouldn't think about anything other than the current election. I'm not on a ballot in 22, so we'll think about things afterwards and see what opportunities may present themselves.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so we're now going to take questions from the audience. I know it's a small room, so you feel like you can just shout it out, but we are recording this, so it's really important you wait for our staff member to bring you a microphone. So if you raise your hand, Tricia there will.
Thank you. I was fortunate enough to work for a Republican senator who spent his entire 2 decades in the minority, and as assistant minority leader helped get more Republican than Democratic votes for those laws, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act that you mentioned. I know that in the last third of a century, the Republicans have only won the popular vote once for the White House, meaning that maybe somebody who is a black Republican, maybe who wins in a Democratic district that's largely Latino might have a good chance to win. I don't know if you want to make any announcements tonight, but is there anyone who might run who you would think you should step aside because he'd make a better president? And on the other hand, is there anyone who might run who you'd be scared to run against?
Look, that's a very interesting hypothetical question. So, look, I think there are a number of people that are interesting that would be amazing, that I would be like, that's like the perfect person. My first vote would be Condoleezza Rice, you know? Dr. Rice will get mad at me.
We love her here.
She got me, you know, she's a big football fan, and she still thinks that I was responsible for Stanford losing in San Antonio one time. Very long story. If you're watching, Dr. Rice, I'm sorry. So look, for me, when I advise candidates that are thinking about running for things, it's like, it's never yours to be given. You got to go out and win it, right? And if you think that you can get beat, and if you don't have a good plan, you will get beat, right? And so like for me, I never worry about who the other side is, because it's about executing your plan. And let's be honest, campaigns are actually quite simple. I said I wasn't going to tell the story, but I'll tell it. When I lost, I made 2 errors. I made a strategic error and a tactical error. The strategic error was thinking the runoff election was a continuation of the primary. It's not. It is a different and distinct event. You have different ways of winning. You have different objectives. It is not a continuation. The tactical error I made, this is the classical engineer in me. I said, okay, I'm going to go to the places that I did poorly in, and I'm going to reduce the delta in the places I did poor. You're smiling, and y'all can't see. He's smiling. He's smiling because he knows it's a terrible idea. You win campaigns by IDing your voters and turning them out. Now, to your premise, I have found, whether it was in the 23rd or as I've crisscrossed the country, that way more people exist that want to be inspired, that want to see people disagree without being disagreeable, that want to see people solve problems. So anybody who's able to tap into that, any Republican that's going to be able to tap into that, is going to be the second person in the last 9 presidential elections that could win the popular vote. We had my friend
right
up here. Yeah.
Hold on
Here,
one second.
we want the video audience to know.
I don't need this. Did you start off as a Republican?
Did I start off as a Republican? Yes, right? So look, I always say, growing up, if I were to use 10 adjectives to describe myself, my political affiliation would not have been 10 of them, one of the 10. And I bet you people, a lot of y'all in the room kind of probably felt that way. Now it's like one of the first things people use to identify themselves. But have I been conservative most of my life? Yeah. It starts with my dad. My dad's from East Texas. East Texas, during the Civil War, was the second most important region to the Confederacy outside of Richmond, which is why, after the Civil War, Republicans descended on East Texas, and a lot of Reconstruction in the South was organized from East Texas. So my dad's dad and grandfather was exposed to a lot of Republicans. And my dad always says, I've been a Republican since Lincoln freed us, right? And so it started with that, and then going to a conservative university, Texas A&M University, being exposed to George H.W. Bush. I got to know George W. Bush when he was governor, and then Rick Perry, Governor Perry, or Secretary Perry, I don't know which one you're always supposed to call him. He was one of my, from my alma mater. So I knew Governor Perry really well. And so these were the influences in my life that I always remember. So yeah, I've always leaned conservative most of my life, but I've also, I would say more than that, my goal has always been to fix problems, right? Solve problems, work together, you know? And I think that is what's dominated my life more than anything else.
You had mentioned the fact that in the one primary, only 10% of the voters participated in the primary. And in your book, you talked about the fact that the people who most often participate in the primary are from the fringes, the fringe on the left, the fringe on the right. So when we get to the general election, we have a choice between two fringe parties. So other than somehow magically getting the voters to increase their participation in the primaries, is there another solution to that basic problem?
Well, I usually say the magical solution, if I had a magic wand, it would be to make no district more than +6 in either direction, meaning you don't have a district that's more than 56% Republican or 56% Democrat. A +6, in my opinion, is a jump ball, right? And you allude to some of the math in the book. I talked earlier about how in 2018 there was 34 House seats that were contested. In 2018, the average number of voters in a contested primary, both sides, was 54,000 people. That means 26,501 people decided, on average, 92% of the House seats. That's a crazy small number. Now, in a race like mine in the general election, the number of voters was north of 260,000 people, right? And so the more people that you get to vote is the better. Now, I think the hard work is to get more voters to vote. When I first got elected, I was asked to speak at an event in Austin, Texas called South by Southwest. South by Southwest is a movie conference, a music conference, and a technology conference. And I'm on the stage with 4 YouTube stars. The 4 of them combined had 1 billion subscribers. At that time, I had 60, right? And I think 4 are in this room. And one of the women on the panel was the digital director for The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. And this is when the movie Moana was coming out. And she said, if Moana fails at the box office, are you going to blame the consumer the moviegoer, or are you going to blame the product, the movie? And she said, of course, you're going to blame the movie. Now, I'm not saying Moana was a coming movie. I found it quite delightful, and I thought it did pretty well at the box office. She goes on to say, it's only in politics do you blame the consumer, the voter, instead of the product, the politician. And so I actually believe the opportunity is for somebody to provide a different vision and to focus on those things that unite us, to inspire rather than fearmonger, to show that you are having your audio and your video match. That's the opportunity. Now, the professional political class is not geared to talk to those people. The professional political class is geared to talking to 4 of 4s. A 4 of 4 voter is somebody who has voted in 4 of the last 4 Republican primaries or 4 of the last 4 Democratic primaries. And that's who you only talk to. Because people that run these races, they're running 6 or 7 around the country. And that's why you get these nationalized races where you talk about the exact same thing in 6 or 7 different races. That is how this system is continuing to perpetuate. So sir, to your point, it's hard. It's hard to get new voters in. But guess what? We got to do it. And I know it can work because that's how I got elected. Nobody, and I've said this a few times, nobody thought a black Republican was going to win in a 71% Latino district who had just moved back to Texas after being away for 15 years. You know? But we did that by getting new people in to vote, and because you talk about different things.
We have time for one more
Okay, gotcha.
question. Oh, whichever way you're going.
Yeah.
Thank you. We are a world seemingly at war. What do you think we need to do? Is the American president, is the American Congress doing enough to help the Ukraine?
Sure. The short answer to the question is we should be doing more. So here is my philosophy on this, and I break this down in the book. Having been connected to the national security community for over 2 decades, I've learned a simple principle. Your friends should love you, and your enemies should fear you. Seems straightforward, right? But that starts with knowing who your friends are and who your enemies are. I hope no other president ever tries to rethink or reimagine relationship with Vladimir Putin. It will never work. He is always going to be an adversary. Now, I believe, and look, the United States government is giving a lot of support and help to the Ukrainians. There's no question about that. But I think us and the West can do more. And I'm of the opinion we should be giving them every single heavy weapon that the Ukrainians can manage. When President Zelensky is saying thank you, but you're not doing enough, that's an example of your friend not loving you. When Vladimir Putin is leveling cities, it's because he doesn't fear the other side's going to do anything. Now, when I talk about doing everything from providing airplanes and all this, now I don't think we should have boots on the ground. I don't think that's necessary at this point. We'll give them the equipment to do this themselves. People say, oh, escalation. It's going to escalate. Well, in 2014, when the Russians first invaded Ukraine, and a bipartisan House, Republicans and Democrats were saying, hey, give them those javelins to blow up the tanks. No, that's going to escalate the crisis. In December of last year, when people were saying, put sanctions on the Russians to prevent the Russians from going in, no, that's going to be escalation. We will never be able to predict second, third, fourth, fifth order of effects, which means rely on first principle. And the first principle in this case, in my opinion, is do everything we can to prevent the massacre of innocent people. Period, full stop. And be prepared for the response. Now, will Vladimir Putin loose a nuclear weapon? That's the real question. That's the real concern everybody has. It is within Russian doctrine a concept called escalate to de-escalate. It is Russian doctrine to loose one nuclear weapon when you're losing the war to scare everybody to calm down. But in 35 years of war games, escalate to de-escalate has never happened. It's always led to what we all know as MAD, mutually assured destruction. Now, if the Russians use even a tactical nuclear weapon, the entire world will marginalize. China will. And if you look at, of the 190 countries in the UN, 140 are not involved in cooperating with Western sanctions against the Russians. That's a lot, by the way. The Russians lose a nuclear weapon, all that would go away, the entire world would be against them. Also, are they going to try to do something in Poland? The Polish army is more equipped and more professional than the Ukrainian army. The Russians can't even handle the Ukrainians. Do you think they're going to want to introduce other factors? You think they want French fighter planes in Ukraine? I'm sure Macron would love to have an excuse to launch those in his re-election or in his race against Le Pen. So that's what I think we should be doing. Oh, and by the way, what we do now is going to influence future wars. Why did Vladimir Putin go into Ukraine at this time? Because he saw what happened in our disastrous withdrawal of Afghanistan. I'm one of the people, I'm sorry I'm getting worked up. I despise the term forever war. I find it offensive. I find it offensive because the reason I remember August before 9/11 and everybody in the CIA being concerned and worried about what was going to happen, that we were hearing, this is where chatter started coming up. And so we knew that a small footprint of 3,500 people would have prevented what happened in Afghanistan. That is a fraction of the footprint that we have in in South Korea, in Japan, in Germany, in so many other places. But the departure, guess what? Republican and Democratic voters didn't want to stay in Afghanistan. Putin saw that, we're going in. Xi Jinping is now thinking, okay, this is how the world's going to react when we invade Taiwan. And how is what we're learning there going to influence that conflict? Mm-hmm. That's why, and by the way, that's my last point, I swear. That's what I swear. The longer this conflict continues, the worse it is for Europe. Why? Because our Eastern European governments are dealing with a population that is living under the threat of war. The closer you are to Russia, the more you're impacted by secondary sanctions, and 3, you're dealing with a humanitarian crisis from the Ukrainian refugees. Last month, Warsaw, just Warsaw, the city of Warsaw alone, increases population by 14%. That's insane. And so the longer our Eastern European allies are having to deal with these challenges, you're going to start seeing friction and fractures amongst the Western alliance, which is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. So the sooner we end this, by giving the Ukrainians what they need to end it themselves, the better it is going to be for the rest of the world. Oh, and by the way, foreign policy ain't foreign. This has impact back home, right? We're learning that at the pump. We're learning that at food prices. We're learning that with inflation. And so it requires us to be educated. And I swear this, and I'm wrapping this all up, the whole night wrapping this up. America's at its best when we live in our values. Mm-hmm. We talk about America being an experiment. Why was it an experiment? Because nobody thought it was going to work. It wasn't until 60 years after we started this experiment that there was another democracy, Switzerland. There's only 14 countries that have been a democracy for more than 100 years. America has become an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. We gave Europe a helping hand after World War II. We give a helping hand to countries 6,000 miles away when they deal with a natural disaster. And we've given the world an example of how self-government is actually working. This experiment has worked for 247 years. Yes, we have a ways to go, but that's why we're always trying to find this more perfect union. And there's no other better form of government. It has helped the American economy increase and be the envy of the world, and it's helped uplift humanity. Let's keep it going for another 247 years. Thank you.
So, to summarize that ending, actually, if you have not, I see a lot of you holding the book. If you have not yet purchased the book, I highly recommend you do so. It really is a roadmap of what we can do as humans, as Americans, as Republicans to make this world a better place. So we are going to go into the bookstore, give us just about 30 seconds head start, and then we hope to see all of you there, and we'll be happy to sign your books. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.